here. So welcome to this webinar. I'm glad you're all here in person. This is being recorded, but it's much better to have you here in person. And we're going to have some interactive bits later on with time for questions. And it's nice knowing that so many of you are interested in this. So this webinar is titled Analyzing Crop Profitability and Financial Metrics on Flower Farms, which is the name of my grant that was funded last year through the WSARE Farmer and Rancher Grant. We're wrapping up the grant for the year, but in exciting news, we were funded for a larger version of this grant for this coming season, actually 2 seasons to come, also through WSARE, but transitioning to like a bigger, more intense grant called the Professional and Producer Grant. So welcome. I will tell you a bit about the background of this project before handing it over to Tanya Murray, who I'll introduce. So first of all, on my farm, as I've gotten more serious over the years, I started to have a hunch that some crops were making me money and some crops were losing me money. As those of you who know me know, this is kind of my soapbox recently, is like, what are we all doing as small, insanely diverse flower farms? We're running around like headless chickens, headless farmers, growing a million different things, and we're not always sure exactly why we're growing those crops. I've taught a lot of workshops this winter, and I have kind of juxtaposed 2 types of farmers next to each other. One group is those who plan their crops based on, their tried and true market demand, their crop cost and profitability, and what works really well in their climate. But of course, this farmer doesn't exist. It is juxtaposed with the other farmer who grows their crops, chooses their crop list rather based on like some sense of perceived demand, some pictures from Instagram of what other flower farmers are growing, what they personally like growing, or what seeds were available to them that year. And, I had everyone in those sessions I taught raise their hands and say, yeah, for the most part, that's how they chose their crop list. I know there are farmers who are more evolved than that, but most of us are not, at least until year like 6 or 7 or something along those lines. So this has become my research over the past few years. I'm pretty new to this crop production analysis. I'm currently writing a book, finishing it up, called Flower Farming for Profit, which will come out through Chelsea Green either later this year or early next year as books go. But this was a big question of mine. Which crops are making me money? Which crops are losing me money? Are there farmers out there who are in touch with this? I know there's a few flower farmers who have been pretty vocal about doing what's called enterprise budgets or cost of production analyses. Jello Mold Farm is one, Sunny Meadows is another one, but beyond that, and Roots Flower Farm does a lot of this kind of thing, as you guys will see. But beyond that, most of us have not done this work. So even the farmers who are really successful and are making a good living for themselves are probably out of touch with which crops on their farm are supporting the rest of the crops they're growing. So I set out to see how I could become more in touch with how my crops were actually performing on my farm, and then see how I could rope other flower farmers into this. We know that some crops are really needy, so they take a lot of time. And then we know that some crops don't take a lot of time or work or labor hours, but we can sell those for a really high selling price. So those might stand out in our mind as profitable crops, but really profitability is a more complex matrix of, a plant's yield and its labor hours and its selling price. And so to try to get on top of all of these, I started looking into studies that have been done in the vegetable world, because they're a little bit ahead of us in this type of thing. A lot of you probably know Richard Wiswall's book and have read that, and it's both wonderful and confusing. And then there are some other methods popping up all the time to track kind of cost of production on crops. However, the big confusing piece and the most complicated piece and the most telling piece is really that labor component. How much time do you spend with this crop? We'll talk more about this all throughout the day, but I found Tanya Murray, who works at Oregon Tilth, She has been doing this type of work for years. She's a farm viability specialist, and last year was instrumental in planning and running the National Farm Viability Conference, which was wonderful. And I saw her talking about this program that she had developed out of the, and she will say this correctly, but the OSU Center for Small Farms in collaboration with Oregon Tilth had developed this wonderful course, and in it this program called Know Your Cost to Grow. We'll refer to it as the Know Your Cost to Grow tool or program or course. It's the same thing we're talking about. And I said, how can I get involved in that? How can I use this program, work with Tanya, and get funding to bring in other farmers? So I applied for the WSARE Farmer and Rancher Grant, brought in 4 farmers to work with me over the course of the year, with Tanya Murray as our technical advisor and really our guiding force throughout this whole project. So these farmers have worked closely with me and with Tanya over the past year, tracking their crops through this program. It's the first time it's been used as a real, it's the first time it's been used for flower farmers as a cohort. There have been a few other flower farmers who have used it in bits and pieces over the years, and it's really been in development. So it was kind of in beta testing in years leading up to this. And Tanya will talk way more about this program, but it's been a wonderful experience. We've learned a lot. And I just want to say who was involved real quick, because they'll be chiming in later, but not for a while. So Shanti Raid of Whipstone Farm in Arizona, Michelle Elston from Roots Flower Farm in Pennsylvania, Aaron McMullen from Raindrop Farm in Oregon, and Gina Strathman from Longer Table Farm in California. I believe that's it. We had a few other people who started out with us and dropped off, and we ended up with this wonderful group. Just seeing if I need to say anything else before I hand it over. I believe that's it, but just to give you a brief rundown of the morning, I'm going to be handing it over to Tanya in a minute, and she'll give you some background of the need for the Know Your Cost to Grow program, what it came from, and then how it works, the ins and outs. We will eventually then be looking at some results and then playing through some scenarios of different results that could have been if some factors were different. We'll give you some tips on how you can get started doing this kind of work, and we will open it up for input from the farmers who participated and also Q&A from you guys. So I think that's it, and here's Tanya.
Thanks, Lenny. And one quick thing, Lenny, I can't really monitor the chat. So if you can do that, and if there's a need to interrupt me, feel free to do that and jump in. And likewise, if folks have questions, feel free to unmute and ask too. I don't mind being interrupted as I go. So like Lenny said, I just wanted to share a little bit about Know Your Cost to Grow. It is a program that was developed through a partnership between Oregon Tilth and Oregon State University's Center for Small Farms and Community Food Systems. We've had support from several different grants, but the Beginner Farmer and Rancher Grant most recently is supporting my work on continuing to offer this program. And it was really developed to help initially diversified vegetable farmers to figure out their crop-specific costs of production, with a real focus on information for business decision-making, and the idea that, getting this cost of production information can help you make better business decisions to ultimately, hopefully, increase your bottom line. That really came out of, like Lenny talked about, the experience of being a flower farmer, growing lots of different flower crops and not really knowing, which crops to focus on. And I would say that in the vegetable world, that was my experience as a diversified vegetable farmer too. And, I see a similar trend there, and partly because of that diversity that in vegetables and in diversified flower farmers, because of that diversity, it just becomes harder to do the kind of cost analysis that is necessary on the individual crop basis. And so I developed Know Your Cost to Grow with a real goal to try to essentially get to the point where you could cost out, ideally, like all of your crops faster, or faster being easier, getting there sooner. And so that's kind of just some brief background on the program. I also just wanted to throw in there, I might say this on my next slide, but Lenny, you talked about like kind of knowing intuitively that different crops take more, I think what you called futzing, and then said, labor. And I would say that that is a big piece also in the vegetable world, and we're seeing that in flowers. And so labor is a big part of Know Your Cost to Grow, as you'll hear about in a minute. I did also just want to call out that this is really just one approach to costing. There's different ways you could do it. And whether or not you are interested in using Know Your Cost to Grow, which we will tell you about how you can do that in the future. If you're interested, really, we're hoping that the lens of costing and kind of how it applies and what you can learn from doing this kind of analysis is more of what you get from the webinar today. But I did want to really give you a little more background on Know Your Cost to Grow, so you have some context for what these growers did to get to their cost numbers, because I would say whenever you're looking at cost numbers, it's really critical to ask where did this come from? Because it could include some things and not other things. And especially if you're starting to think about comparing your operation to someone else's or planning around the costs that are out there, without knowing what's behind that one number of cost or profit, you're really kind of going in blind. And so a little more on Know Your Cost to Grow. One, I just wanted to emphasize that, like Lenny said, it was initially developed as a course, and I have kind of veered away from calling it that because that sounds a little more academic. I would say it's really meant to be something that is practically applied, but it is a program that has these three main parts. One is three main modules. One is the Record It module, which is where you really focus on identifying what records you need to keep in order to ultimately do that cost calculation. And in that Record It module, there's also an emphasis on thinking about your record keeping systems and what you're going to need to set up going into the season. The second module is the Calculate It module, which is really where the web-based application that you do the costing in lives. So that's really just about plugging in your numbers and getting some results. And then the third module is called Analyze It, and that module is really focused on analyzing the results that you get and looking at ways that you can use them, exploring changes you might make to increase profit. And I will say, for the group of growers that participated in the WSARE project, we actually haven't gone through that module together. And so today's webinar is sort of like that module live in action. So we're getting to kind of explore that as a group. We're going to focus mostly on one farm's results for today, but I think this will all be useful for all the growers in the project and hopefully everyone else as well. So let's see, a little more on just the actual costing process in Know Your Cost to Grow, and then we will shift gears to looking at some initial results. This is a really, really quick overview. Usually I do this in like an hour session, so I'm not expecting that you fully digest this, but I just want to give a little bit of background. One thing is that the focus in Know Your Cost to Grow is really on variable costs of production, because we want to understand what costs are going to change if you grow more or less of each individual crop. So we're really focusing in on those variable costs. Labor is a big cost, and it is sometimes not accounted for, and it's hard to account for because you have to keep records when you're already doing too many things. And so a big focus of Know Your Cost to Grow is trying to get at that labor in a way that is doable. Other inputs are rolled in here as well, so like seed costs and amendments and that kind of thing, but we're really honing in on the labor. The way that labor is accounted, or the way that labor is tracked and then calculated in Know Your Cost to Grow, is by doing what are called time studies, where you're really focused on measuring the time that different labor activities take. So a couple examples here, how long it takes to prepare the ground for planting, how long it takes to seed or to transplant a crop, how long it takes to harvest. And those are just a few examples, and there's actually more kind of detailed levels that you get into when you do this. But once you've done those time studies on those activities, those are used to calculate labor activity rates. And that is really the core the core part of Know Your Cost to Grow that makes it easier then to ultimately do more crops. Because when you start to look at your production, it turns out that not all, but many, I would say, of the production labor activities are going to take the same rate of time regardless of the crop. And so we're kind of using that to be able to then look at more crops, as I said earlier, sooner, quicker, easier. So focusing on those labor activity rates, which come from doing time studies, is really key. And we'll end today talking a little bit about how those happen and how the growers in today's project, in this year's project, were able to work on those, and where they maybe struggled to, because there's always something to learn from that. I actually can't see my last note, so I'm moving over. Right, so the last step here is in the process is applying the actual labor activity rates to different crops, depending on what the steps are for each crop, and then also depending on the occurrences of each activity. So again, this might not all sink in right now, but just wanted to give a little bit of background here so that you have some idea of where this is coming from, and we'll be talking a little more about the time studies at the end of the webinar. The last thing that I wanted to share before Lenny goes over some results from one of the farms is just the key metric that we look at in Know Your Cost to Grow, which is called contribution margin. And the contribution margin, and I'll be referring to this a lot as we kind of look more at the results today, is the amount that is left to contribute to covering fixed costs after your crop-specific variable costs have been covered. And so the math here is kind of hopefully what will make that make more sense. So you take the price of a crop, you subtract price per unit, you subtract the variable cost per unit, and what you have left is the contribution margin per unit. You can also look at the contribution margin on a per bed basis, a per labor hour basis, and even in total. And I'll talk about those different ways of looking at it as we go. But what's really important is here the separation of the variable costs being covered, and then what we have left is available to cover the other costs that need to be covered in order for usually for like the business to be profitable, but those crops don't change in relationship to the amount that is produced of the crop that you're looking at. So that's a really important metric, and we'll be referring back to it a lot. With that, I'm going to hand it back to Lenny to go over some initial results that we have to share today.
Great, thank you. Yeah, and this concept of the contribution margin can sound really confusing. It's also really important, and it's kind of the key metric that we focus on. So I'll try to mention it a few more times. So I also wanted to say that today in sharing these results, we're not going to be sharing any larger benchmarks across farms for one crop. We're not going to show you it costs $5 to grow a bunch of dahlias or whatever. We're showing you a few examples from one farm, and we can talk about why. Even this year was sort of, we got some really great data this year, but a lot of it was sort of trial and error, seeing how these farmers worked with this program. We also got a really late start last season. And so we have really great results for each farm, but it's a whole other bag of complications to try to compare the results from one farm to the next. We'll be doing it a little bit, but we're not, it would take a lot more analysis in order to be able to say something definitive about, small farms grow dahlias in this way with these costs. So here we're looking at one crop on one farm. So we're looking at dahlia production on Whipstone Farm. So the big question we're trying to answer, the first step rather, is did they have a positive contribution margin? So rephrasing that question, we're saying, did the dahlia production at Whipstone Farm this past season, did the dahlias generate enough returns to cover their specific variable costs for growing that crop, plus additional contribution, additional funds to contribute to that kind of what we think of as business overhead or to all those other costs. Also, that's where your profit is going to come from. So The first answer is yes. So dahlias on Whipstone Farm had a positive contribution margin. So that's the first step. So we can just stay there for 1 second and think about that. So they had a positive contribution margin. We see here that it was $7.98 per bunch. So like almost $8 a bunch. So $8 a bunch of Whipstone Farm dahlias were left after covering the direct crop variable costs to contribute to covering all the other farms' costs and to providing Whipstone Farm with some profit. So, you know, it also would have been positive if it was 1 cent per bunch. That would have been a whole different answer, but we're looking for a positive number there to start. Just looking at that number in a silo doesn't tell you that much more. You know, we don't know, like by looking at it, you guys don't know by looking at this right now, well, is that good or is that bad? Is that enough? Does that make it worth growing dahlias for Shanti at Whipstone Farm? We're not sure. What we can do is start to compare it to other crops, and then eventually, again, with more analysis, compare it to other farms as well. And Tanya will talk about this, how you might rank crops and then decide what amount of each crop to grow if you in fact are going to continue growing that crop. So the math, sorry, Tanya, I'm kind of going off here.
That's great.
I open my mouth and it doesn't shut. Okay. So the contribution margin was almost $8 a bunch. The math to get there was as follows. Shanti's average selling price was $12 a bunch for her dahlias. The variable cost per bunch was $4.02. So that is the variable crop specific costs, which we'll look at in a second on the next slide. But so basically, if you take the selling price and from that you subtract the variable cost, it comes up with this contribution margin. So that's the starting point, and we can move on to the next one, I believe. So let's look at the cost breakdown per bed. So in the last slide, we were talking about per bunch. Now we're moving on to thinking about a unit of space. So this is 1 bed of dahlias for Shanti. So you can see here, first of all, let's look at the elephant in the room, which is the big green part, the big green pie piece, which is like almost the whole pie, which is the total seed or transplant cost. And it's here at the bottom of this table. The total seed or transplant cost was $800. This was Shanti's tubers, basically. And Tanya in a little bit will be talking more about tuber cost and transplant cost, and we'll look at some differences of producing your own versus buying them in. And one big component of our research this year is going to be trying to figure out this whole world of saving and dividing and either using or selling tubers, because it's a little bit, we've found that it's a little hard to separate out dahlia flower production from dahlia tuber production, how to allocate what returns and what costs to what, but that's a whole other conversation. So centering back in on this slide here, we're looking at the piece of the pie that altogether constitutes the direct variable costs for growing dahlias on Shanti's farm. So just going through them real quick from the top, we have the total field input costs of $74. You can imagine some of the obvious ones here, which might be the total compost and amendments used on that bed, etc., so on and so forth. The total labor costs, which was $294.71. In a minute, we'll move on to kind of highlighting these labor costs and blowing that up into its own pie chart in a second. We have the total machinery costs, which is a little tricky to get at. And it's, you know, I'd be confident in saying that this is based on some data and some estimates, which is fine. You can also see that it's, in my mind, it's not going to rake the bank. It's not going to change the conversation for this crop, even if it is an estimate. The total packaging costs $30, and then the total seed or transplant costs $800. So just from looking at this, you can see, okay, transplant costs, i.e. tuber costs, was a huge factor in determining the relative success or the relative profitability or the contribution margin of this crop. And so you can see that that might be something to be studied more, but we'll move on to that. I think let's move on to the next slide, and then I'll open it up for the farmers to chat. So like I said, now we are zooming in on that piece that was just the total labor for this crop. the total labor hours. So let's start again with the biggest piece of the pie, which is harvest. It's that, like, would we call that teal? It's a teal color. So I don't know if this is a surprise. We can talk about this in a minute, but harvest labor was by far the biggest component of labor for this crop, for dahlias. Is that intuitive or not? I mean, I'm not sure. Dahlias do take a while to harvest. That's something we'll talk about more. Going up to the top now, bed preparation, 0.62 labor activity hours, transplanting 1.03, irrigation 0.22, weed management 1.20, plant care, which can be a little bit different from farm to farm, but I imagine it involves maybe pinching the plants, maybe corralling or netting the plants, and so on and so forth, pest control, 0.58, and then harvest 16 hours to get these crops out of the field. So again, is that good or bad? Hard to say, but it definitely is. It shows you that it's worth studying and it's worth fine tuning. So I think now would be a good point for me to open it up first to the farmers in the study to share with you, what do you guys think when you look at these numbers, either Shanti's numbers or if you've looked at your own. I know Gina's, not that this is everything, but Gina's dahlia numbers happen to be very close to Shanti's numbers, which was funny. But do these numbers surprise you? Do these ratios surprise you? What were your thoughts looking at these results? And you can just chime in, Shanti, let's hear it.
I think everything surprises me. I love looking at numbers. It's easy to have thoughts about something and how it works, but I'm always surprised by actual numbers and like being able to see it. So nothing's like completely shocking here. Like, yes, I would say harvesting is the most labor intensive part of dahlias because they're a very long season crop, right? So like for sunflowers, if you're doing one bed, you're maybe harvesting it over a week or two at the most, but this is like a very long season of harvest. And so, yes, we also use some like tractor cultivation for weed management. So maybe like our numbers are less than if you were doing it all by hand. And we did not like corral or trellis anything here. So I think the plant management was like pinching, and maybe, I don't know if there was something else in there, but so it doesn't really surprise me. There are a few things that, and I'll get into this later, like some things that are more estimates than real, but I do think that estimating something like one activity, you're probably more accurate than estimating like, do I make money on dahlias, So I still think it has value. Like the machinery cost, like you said, might be a little higher in reality because I didn't do all my homework and get all my numbers in, but I think it's fair to say that like, even if you quadrupled that number, it wouldn't really change what was going on here. And one thing that we did do because of when we started last year is I just assumed that I bought all these tubers at like a wholesale cost, when in reality we saved a lot of them. But I think that labor number would have been very high for the saved dahlia tubers if we accounted for digging and dividing and storing tubers. So that's all I have to say.
That's great.
And I did the same thing.
Go ahead, sorry.
Oh, I was just gonna say, I did the same thing as Shanti. We did dig up and save quite a bit of our tubers last year, but for the sake of just making this easy, we put in the purchase price. But we've been digging and dividing, or we've been dividing tubers lately, and I've been tracking all of that. So I'm excited to see what the numbers show as far as dividing tubers versus buying them in.
Wonderful. And just so everyone knows, at the end of this presentation, in a half hour, whatever it is, we're going to be talking about tracking this stuff and time studies and the ins and out of that. So now we're still continuing to focus on the results, and we'll dive more into the mechanics of tracking this stuff later. But it's such a good point about dahlia division. we really opened up a can of worms by choosing dahlias as one of the crops to focus on, but I think it's really timely and really relevant because we all know that dahlia tuber costs are skyrocketing. They're not available on the wholesale level. Also, farms are making the decision to grow their own tubers for a number of reasons, including keeping staff on during the winter. So, you know, we don't have much more to say about that in this presentation, but in this coming year's research, we will. Do any of the other farmers want to share their thoughts on results, or do other participants in the webinar have any questions or thoughts? I'll read out one question real quick, which was, does the harvest count arranging of dahlias in the bouquets? No. So we're counting pretty much, so there can be harvest labor and post-harvest labor, namely like stripping the stems, whatever it is. Different farms will break those down slightly differently. It doesn't change the overall number, but it does change which bucket of costs you put those hours into. However, I can say categorically that we are only counting the steps with the crop that will be taken across the board if you're selling that. So basically, like the least amount of stuff you would do with that stem of dahlia after it's cut. So if it was going to wholesale or retail, once it's wrapped into a bouquet, designed into a bouquet, that's a whole other category that we would attribute to selling costs rather than growing costs. So it's not included in this study. Someone else has a question, which maybe Tanya can answer, and I can read it here, but it's about COGS basically, which is a really, astute and kind of great question to ask, and it's a complicated answer. But in the business classes I've taken, there's a huge emphasis on COGS. Are COGS relevant here? Is this idea of contribution margin more important, or is it an additional factor to take into account? Thank you. So maybe Tanya can speak to that.
Oh, so I'll try, and I might not get this fully right. So like cost of goods sold is particularly useful, I think, if you are I'm going to call you a merchandiser, meaning you buy stuff and then you sell it, and your cost of goods is the stuff you bought and then sold. And so in that case, I would say that your cost of goods becomes a fully variable cost. Here, we're really looking at what the production costs are. And so that's kind of where the difference is that theoretically, the costs of the dahlia production could become a cost of goods to your own channel. There's some nuance there that I'm not going to get into for a farm that is both producing crops and selling crops, which most of you are. So there's a relationship between them, but I think it's, you just have to be aware of in cost of goods sold, like what's in there. And again, I don't know if that was helpful at all, but what's important about the variable cost piece and the contribution margin is that distinction between what is really variable and what is fixed. And we got down into some pretty nitty-gritty places with that when you start to actually think about timing the activities, thinking about when I go and prep a bed, is the setup time for the tractor fixed or variable? And so I don't want to get off in the weeds on that, but just really thinking about what is going to change if I grow 5 more beds of dahlias. And so that difference is what contribution margin lets you hone in on. And I think COGS may or may not be that specific depending on how it's calculated. So it's a good question. I would say, I think they're a little bit different, and just knowing kind of how that what's in the COGS and what the context is important.
And I've seen a whole, different farm consultants and bookkeepers define COGS differently, which doesn't make anything any easier. I mean, a lot of these definitions are used in slightly different ways. So I think as long as we are defining our terms, we can't go wrong. But I would say from my like personal perspective is that you can forget the conversation of COGS if you're using this instead. This is more nuanced and more tailored to what we're doing here. Thank you. All right. We are amazingly on schedule, if not ahead of schedule. So if we have a few last questions or comments about this specifically, we can take them, and you're welcome to unmute yourself, anyone here, and ask a question or share a thought, and then we'll move on. Michelle.
I was just going to chime in a little bit. I did not do dahlias. I did sunflowers, lysianthus, asters, and ranunculus. And my labor was mostly, my harvest and post-harvest, which I think in light of what you just said, Lenny, really should be clumped together. Because some things you strip in the field, and so that kind of goes into harvest versus stripping in the barn. So we were mostly around 50% for labor, except for ranunculus was 75%, closer to the dahlia example. But I think what you have to remember is that this result has to pair with the contribution margin result that was presented first, because even if it looks like whatever, this is really high, it still could be a wildly profitable crop. And then this result just helps you know where to focus your tweaking of your efficiencies. So that was my biggest lesson, even at 50% labor in harvest and post-harvest, is that's where I want to focus my crew on improvements of process, because that's where we have the opportunity to have the biggest gain. And that was really inspiring to me.
That's wonderful. And on that note, also later, Michelle, I hope you will chime in and share, when we get to the time studies, some thoughts on how doing this kind of work has shaped your crew and your crew's relationship to work on your farm and management, because it's really interesting and inspiring. Okay, in a second, I'm going to hand it back over to Tanya. I just wanted to let everyone know real quick, there's about 40 people here, which is wonderful. Later on, we'll have a few more questions and a new poll, questions that basically I am excited to ask, and have to ask for my grant. So basically, what you're gaining from this webinar. So I hope people will stick around. You're going to get lots of great info coming up, and also I would love to get as many poll responses as possible. So, all right, thank you. I think we can move on, and I'm handing it back to Tanya.
Great. And one other thing, just to kind of tie on to what Michelle said, I think that, it's not always about reducing costs. So an example could be that, this might not be the situation where it makes sense, but like maybe spending that amount more on the tuber costs allows you to get a higher yield. And so there's just different places, like you really have to look at how everything comes together. And I think that, so to your point, like just because harvest is a big cost doesn't mean that the crop isn't going to be going to have a positive contribution margin. So it's a great point. All right, well, I will move on and again, invite questions as they come. So I wanted to just kind of go through some examples of kind of looking at how you might think about using these results, again, to like identify potential changes. And so I think here it's important to really remember that contribution margin is not the same as profit. And so we really need to ultimately like look at that in the larger context of the business. And I'm going to do something for today to keep things simple, which is to pretend that this is a farm that just grows dahlias, because when you start to get into the multi-product situation, you really do need to know your costs of multiple multiple or all your crops in order to look at what I'm about to look at. But imagine in this scenario that you have some fixed costs that need to be covered. Well, you always would have some fixed costs that need to be covered for the business to make a profit. And here I'm going to do a little bit of a what if scenario where we look at the dahlias specifically and look at them not just on a per bunch basis, which is what we were looking at them on before. So we know that the contribution per bunch is $7.98. We're going to expand that out a bit. So first to look at, well, if that's $7.98 is the contribution margin per bunch, and there are 300 bunches coming out of a bed, then the contribution margin per bed comes up to $2,349.90. So I just multiplied the contribution margin per bunch times the number of bunches from a bed. And so I wanted to do that to then jump to what if this farm just grows dahlias, grows about a 1/4 acre of dahlias, which for them equals about 10 beds of dahlias. So in that case, I'm just multiplying the contribution margin per bed by 10 to get a contribution margin of just under 24,000, so $23,949. I'm doing that because I want you then to think about, because you're probably not just growing a bed of dahlias, right? So if this is a farm that's growing 10 beds of dahlias and the fixed costs for the business add up to $25,000, what does that mean? So this is that pot of fixed costs that need to be covered by all the dahlias that are produced. These fixed costs include possibly some production costs, which is maybe surprising, but that don't vary with the volume of dahlias that are produced. I'm not going to give examples of each of these, but just kind of suggesting like these are all things that could be in that fixed cost pot. Some selling costs and also some business administration costs. So those $25,000 are the costs that are going to be the same on my farm, regardless of the volume of dahlia production. And if I subtract those fixed costs from my contribution from the dahlia production, you can see that I have a loss. And so I'm doing this partly because we looked at that initial contribution margin, $798 a bunch, that looks great. But here I'm saying, what if I have to look at covering the fixed costs for the operation? And so if that is the situation, then the question I would ask is, can you increase that contribution margin? And how would you do that? And so we're going to look at that a little bit, because I think this is where the analysis really is useful, is to be able to kind of play with some of these what if scenarios. And so one that I wanted to look at, because it came up, and these are all probably, hypothetical, so I'm not saying we can necessarily implement, but just wanting to look at what if you were able to actually reduce the cost of the tuber that you're buying from $2 a plant to $150. And I actually did this where I took it down and down and down until it got to the point where there was some profit. So it wasn't still, the contribution margin was not enough to cover those fixed costs until I got it down to $150. I did that, and so that reduced the total cost for those tubers. My contribution margin from the dahlias went up, and now instead of a loss, there's a $948 profit. And so that is one scenario. Now, the question might be, Shanti said she plugged in numbers where she had the dahlia as if she was buying them in. She's actually producing her own. Is she producing them for less than she's buying them for, or more? That's something we don't know yet, and we're going to be looking at. But if it's less, then that could be a good thing. So that's one thing that I looked at, and wanted to just give that framework of, or that example of where the fixed cost piece ties in. I also wanted to look at this question around harvest, because that was another big area. Again, question on how would you implement that? I don't have the answer right now, but I'll just put it out there that I wanted to look at this scenario. And so I looked at a scenario where I took the rate for harvest, which was at 3 minutes a bunch, and I dropped it in half to 1.5 minutes a bunch, which reduced the harvest labor hours. And these are on a per bed basis, and down here, everything's just multiplied out by 10. And so when I did that, like the other example, all of a sudden I went from that loss to having a profit, because my contribution margin per bunch went up, my contribution margin per bed went up, and my contribution margin overall went up. And so that was another scenario I wanted to play with. And this is something that you could do with your results, which I think is, it's one thing to play out all these scenarios in the season in real time, which is ultimately where the change has to happen, but helpful also to be able to kind of play with them a little bit and see what would I have to do to increase this crop, and then asking, can you implement? Because just because this says it's better, you have to actually achieve that faster harvest rate and that lower tuber cost, right? So something to consider. I also looked at, just because once I looked at them separately, I wanted to look at those two together. And so when I combined those two scenarios into one, I had enough to cover the fixed costs and my profit comes out to over $2,000. And so, you can see that those two things together would obviously increase the profitability of the business. So good to look at these. The other thing I wanted to look at, I started with the positive, but was this question of, well, what if the tuber costs twice as much? And so this could be like either you buy them, you're buying them and they cost you twice as much, or it could be that they're produced on the farm and that cost goes to twice as much, in which case you would see the labor costs go up. There'd still be some inputs maybe related to the tubers, but it would become an internal cost, but still, your costs overall would go up. And if that happened, you can see that the contribution margin drops quite a bit down to 15,000. I believe it was still positive there on the per bunch basis, but overall, when you plug in those fixed costs, or it was positive overall because it's positive, but you have a loss overall of $4,000. And so, this is a scenario where, you would want to know that either that change or maybe the current situation, once we do the tuber number crunching, will change those costs. And so in this case also, we have been really focusing on the variable costs. That isn't to say that fixed costs can't be changed, meaning that, there could be value in looking at like, well, what's in those fixed costs and could those be reduced? But assuming those aren't changing, we're really focusing on that contribution margin number and seeing how that is, how much that is relative to the fixed costs. And in this case, we have a loss. I have one more example and then I'll pause for a minute. So I also looked at what if the harvest time was instead of being faster, it's slower. So going from the 3 minutes a bunch, now I have, perhaps there's a new person on the farm and they're just learning how to harvest. And so now harvest is taking twice as long. And so all of a sudden my harvest costs go up. And so I still have, it's a smaller loss, but my contribution margin, I think I did something backwards there, but this should be less than this. So sorry about that, but my contribution margin is actually, less than my fixed costs. So yeah, I have something backwards on my slide, but there's a loss, believe me. And so I just wanted to present that as, a way that you might look at using these results in terms of thinking about changes that you could make and looking at how they would impact the operation. I'll pause and see about questions or reflections on that part. I feel like I'll switch it to a slide that actually makes sense.
And no question is too big or too small. I know there's always a lot of people sitting there, wondering if what they're wondering, if other people are wondering it too. So feel free to jump in, whoever you are.
I guess one thing, you didn't run the scenario, I hope, and I didn't miss it, but like another way to maybe look at a higher profit would be to increase your production, right? Because your fixed cost is like a big chunk there. If your fixed cost is going to be the same for like double the amount. So, I mean, that's part of what this is all about, right? Like if you were to double your production, would you make more money? So as long as you could absorb that quantity of sales, like your profit would go way up.
Yes, if you increase your volume and your fixed costs stay the same, yes, that's true. And the other thing that we were talking about before we actually started the webinar today, Shanti, that you brought up was you could also think about, could you increase your marketable yield? And so there's in this analysis, there's two ways to kind of look at your yield. There's the yield that is the amount that you actually harvest from a bed, which drives your harvest costs because every stem that you harvest has a labor cost to it. And then there's also the portion of your whole harvest that is marketable or sellable. And so if you have loss from harvest until when you sell, or, I mean, this is another layer of looking at it, product that is unsold, it's really what is marketable that has to absorb all of the costs that went into the bed. That's what's useful in a forward planning scenario. If you were looking at it kind of after the fact, you would also say, well, it was what was actually sold that is what has to absorb all the costs into a bed. Because this was really developed to be able to plan in the future, you're not really going to know what you actually sell, like what really happens. So you're going to be relying more on like what is going to be marketable or sellable, those estimates. But the point being that like it's the amount that is actually sellable that has to absorb all the costs. So if you can increase that, you would also see some gain there because you're essentially using your space and your efforts more efficiently. All right, well, if there's other questions or comments on this part, we're happy to hear them. I did want to show one other way to look at this and another kind of metric that I think is really useful. And this becomes more useful when you're starting to compare crops and really trying to make decisions about product mix. And so there's two numbers that are outputs of the know your cost to grow process that are useful to look at. And those are comparing crops based on either the contribution margin per bed or the contribution margin per labor hour. The tool doesn't get into kind of doing those together. But the idea here is that you usually have a primary constraint. So you may be limited in terms of the amount of space you have or the amount of labor. If you're thinking both, then you just kind of have to choose one in terms of this analysis. But in this case, if you were limited in terms of the amount of space you had, looking at the Dahlia contribution margin per bed, so that's just taking the number of stems per bed times, the number of bunches per bed times the contribution margin per bunch. And looking at that number, you would compare that or could compare that to another crop's contribution margin per bed. And this tells you that if you're limited on space, you would be better off growing more dahlias than more sunflowers. Likewise, you can also look at the contribution margin, per labor hour. And on the per labor hour comparison, this is saying my main constraint is the amount of labor hours that I have. And so the question here would be, which crop would I focus on? And in this case, actually, for this case study operation or case study of Whipstone Farm, it would make more sense to emphasize the sunflowers. And so those are really important ways to look at this in terms of the decisions between different crops. And ultimately, what you could do once you have your costs done for, say, all the crops you grow, is rank them by the one of these that is your primary constraint, and then really look at what's the minimum amount of each flower that you might grow. And I say that for that many things can inform the minimum. And I wanted to flag this because Lenny, you were talking about this at the beginning, but that's where things could factor in, like, I just really like to grow these, or it's somehow important in my rotation. So there's a lot of different reasons. Or if you're doing a flower CSA, maybe they really fill a niche in terms of the season or at the market in the season. So lots of different reasons you might commit to a minimum of things that may not have the best contribution margin, but you're going to grow them anyway. Then you would look at what's the maximum of each crop I'm going to grow. And that's really important then to think of kind of the maximum being like, well, there's only so much I can sell. So having the market really inform that, like, what is my highest potential amount of sales? And then maybe there's some things that you're going to limit the amount you grow, even though, you could sell more for other reasons around rotations or because you don't love something. So you've got your maximums. And once you do that, you can kind of fill the remaining space that wasn't filled with your minimum amounts with the maximums. And that is really the process to kind of get you towards your ultimately the product mix that's going to give you the highest return overall. And that's something to think about doing, I would say, once you've done your analysis on more crops. But, at this level, even you can see it in comparing 2 different crops. And I think, it's where all those other factors kind of come into play, meaning the market, meaning your preferences, meaning what your different kind of agronomic factors would be. So really useful to look at. And the last thing I'll say on this is, for some folks that aren't necessarily thinking about putting their time in as a cost because they don't pay themselves, in that sense, you still might want to look at the returns per labor hour, because even though you're not directly paying yourself a paycheck, you still may want to use your time to kind of get the highest return with these other factors also in mind. So really useful numbers to look at to compare crops, and interesting to see how these 2 played out for Whipstone Farm. Questions on this part, comments?
And I'll share that when Tanya talks about this, I immediately in my mind, I picture sort of a field map. And I picture whether it's 10 beds or 100 beds, at any scale, like the process of starting with deciding the minimum amount. So like, yeah, I need sunflowers for my summer CSA, but I don't think they do too well for me, or they've shown to not do too well for me. So I'm only going to grow whatever it is, 1 bed of them, and then doing the same with dahlias, then going to the maximum, then filling in. So I'm picturing like a field map. In my mind, it's a spreadsheet being colored in with these different amounts of crops until you find that sweet spot of the amount where you're kind of maxing out the amount of crop. Like there's a crop with a great contribution margin. You're maxing out the amount of that crop you're going to grow where you can still sell it. You have the proven demand. You can still sell it at the price that brings you the contribution margin you have in mind. I think I said that right. So I would love in the future, like my dream is to have a real data from a real farm and we show a field map of the first year. They have 10 beds, whatever, 100 beds, and this is their crop mix. And then once they've done this cost analysis on a bunch of different crops, their crop mix changes. I'm guessing they would grow a lot more of some crops and a lot less of the others, and their whole makeup would look different. And essentially by putting in the same amount of hours on their farm, they do a lot better in the end as a result of doing this. So even if you're not going to get into this level of detail of it, I think, like Tanya said earlier, looking at your crops through this lens, even as a result of coming to this webinar, our hope is that you go home and look at your crops and break them down into these little pieces and start evaluating them through this kind of ultimate profitability lens.
Yeah, that's great. We only have like 38 crops to go too.
Yeah,
I also just wanted to throw in here that often people will ask about the idea here of loss leaders. And I think that, this is where, if you have some things that are lower contributors, you can see that, you can still do them and they're just part of that mix. I think where you have to be careful is if you have something that is essentially has a negative contribution margin. What that means is that every additional bunch or stem of that crop that you grow, you're losing more money. And so you can do that too, but you need to be making that up somewhere else. So it's good to be aware of, which is kind of why we started with that first metric of the contribution margin per bunch and checking that that was positive. Because if it weren't, that would kind of be like the red flags. But in this ranking system, I would say probably starting with everything positive would be best. If not, you're looking at making things up somewhere else. All right, well, I think we will transition now to just kind of talking about next steps. Lenny, did we want to do the poll here and then kind of get into the time study part?
Yeah, I'm going to launch this poll, which is just a few, it's like 12. It's a few questions that are all yes or no's. It'll just take you a minute here. Let me go here. All right, do you guys see that webinar second poll? Has it been launched?
Not yet for me.
No. Sorry, if you keep talking, I can figure this out. I have to end the first poll and start the second one.
There.
Here we go.
Yes, now it's
There we
on.
go. Okay. Great. I don't think I need to introduce this at all, right? So this poll is going to sit here. You guys are to answer these questions, please, knowing that there's more information to come, but you can only imagine it's only going to get better.
Yeah, it looks like we've got 11 questions really quick. And yes, just if you could respond to the poll, and then we'll kind of move on to our next part around what you might do to get started with this process of costing.
Perfect. Thank you. The answers are coming in. Thank you. If I was a bigger person, I'd have door prizes of some sort. All right, we're sort of hovering at 26 people have responded out of 32, so that might be approaching it.
All right. Well, we'll move on then. So again, we were hoping that presenting some of this information would get you all thinking about cost analysis in general and encourage you to do your own cost analysis. If you're interested specifically in being part of the Know Your Cost to Grow program, our next cycle of that won't start until 2024. So it's a little bit of a teaser, I suppose. But we knew that and just wanted to say that there's actually quite a bit you could do this season if you're excited to take a look at some of this that I think could even start to give you some feedback on where you're spending your time and how your labor looks, and also around kind of getting you set up to do this successfully in the 2024 season. And so the two places we thought we would suggest folks focusing, one is on doing harvest time studies, because as we saw, harvest for the analysis we looked at, harvest was the largest cost, and I think it's safe to say that was true across all the farms, and probably is intuitive to a lot of you, and so that would be something we would encourage. And then the other part here, which I think is beneficial not just for costing, but also very much for crop planning, would be really thinking about having good systems in place for collecting yield data, because you really have to know what your yields are in order to do a cost analysis. And I'll also say, I think that's sort of a low-hanging fruit area around profitability, where if you can really try to dial in the amount that you're producing with the amount that you can sell, you're eliminating essentially waste in your system, waste of not just the flowers that you might be not harvesting or composting, but your time and your resources that you've invested into production that you might not need, which isn't to say you shouldn't have no cushion, you shouldn't have eliminate all cushion in your plantings, but just kind of trying to dial that in by knowing what your yields are. And so So kind of get the growers, give the growers a chance to talk about what they found useful, and their experience with the record keeping. I'll hand it off to you, Lenny, and you can kind of set that up, and then we'll take it from there.
Yeah, thanks. So I'm going to open it up to the farmers in our grant in a second. Talking specifically about the process of doing time studies. So what did you discover from doing time studies? What tips do you have for getting them done? What worked, maybe what didn't work? Because it's so funny. A lot of the success of this program or doing anything like this for cost analysis comes down to like really specific nitty gritty stuff, such as like, did you have a notebook on your tractor? Or did you decide who was going to be doing the timekeeping and how did you do it? So just to reiterate really quickly that, there are different programs out there for doing cost analysis or enterprise budgets. What I really love about this and what Tanya really developed with this program is the importance of getting at rates. So using rates and using time studies rather than saying, okay, this season I'm going to go out and write down every time I start to work on my dahlia crop, I'm going to write down all of those minutes. Like that's not what's happening here. What's happening here is that we are doing time studies, recording slices of time to get to averages and average rates. And it is really, in my mind, a far cry from attempting to time yourself every time you're involved with the crop. Also, that system doesn't allow you to use those rates and apply them to other crops in your production. I didn't say that very well, but I'd like to open it up to the farmers in the study to answer some of these questions. Go ahead and chime in, especially if we haven't heard from you yet, but also if we have.
So I'll chime in.
Love it.
Okay, so I'm going to set this up by just being brutally honest that this is not my strength. I am not an organizer. I am not analytical. I am not a record keeper, period, end of sentence. So this was really challenging for me. And both Lenny and Tanya are like, yeah, we know, Erin. However, I did learn some things. I learned a lot about both myself and my skill set and where I needed to lean on other people. And I think that's one of the biggest skills that as a business owner and as an employer, I've learned over the last maybe 5 years overall. And this program and being a part of it and trying to utilize it to my benefit has really kind of reiterated that for me. So a couple of the takeaways that I have are that one, I was really hesitant to involve my crew or anyone else in any of these time studies or in any of the kind of in any of the data collection because I wasn't really sure how to do it and I didn't therefore know how to teach someone else how to do it or even really what I was trying to accomplish with it. So having been in this study through the years really given me that idea of like what even really matters. Like, and to Lenny's point that you just made, Lenny, being able to recognize that I don't need to be like, did you spend 15 minutes just now doing that? Oh, no, you spent 7 minutes. Okay, I'm going to add that to the 14 that you spent yesterday and trying to like nitpick every single moment that we spend. So having the freedom to do the time studies really helped me to wrap my head around how I could functionally use this information. So the biggest thing for me that I'm going to change this year is I was really, like I said, I was really hesitant to include my employees or really even let them know what I was doing. Quite honestly, I was like out there with my notebook, like writing in it. And then I realized that it probably looked really creepy to them. I was probably like, you know, they were going, well, why is she taking notes? And why is she like watching us do things? So I pulled in a couple of them and explained to them what they were doing. And to my surprise, one of them was super excited about it. So she has taken on like the interest of being able to do this. And that's really exciting for me. So hopefully that will pan out a little bit better. But the other thing that, you know, a lot of what I noticed was that when we, and it's kind of that lean farming like method that I try to lean into and I constantly am falling short of, is that once I had the time studies and I recognize, well, it does take us this X amount of time to do this. and X amount of time to do that. It really helped me to plan my day. Nothing to do with like the outcome and the numbers that I came up with, but it really gave me a baseline to utilize my staff more effectively overall. So that was really helpful. So those are like the two things for me.
That's great, Erin. I just wanted to chime in and say, when I've heard folks bringing in their employees, if they have them, I think most people have said that it's been really useful. And I do think making sure folks understand like why you're doing it and what the time study data is going to be used for is important, partly because, you know, you could have a side benefit of people working faster because they're doing time studies, but that's not actually going to give you the best data that you should probably plan your business on if it's not representative of what they can ultimately do. So just being, you know, clear about why and that you're using it for looking at your costs and planning going forward is important. And it's great to include people if you can do that and have it be kind of a group project that way.
It also really opens up the capability because I'm not there every day.
Right.
Like to harvest like with the dahlias are one of the things that I thought I would love to do last year. And it just became overwhelming because we just have so many of them. And the thought of trying to keep track just blew my mind. I just couldn't manage it. But being able to enlist someone else to help with that, we've got kind of a plan for the year that other people are in on, which helps me quite a bit.
And in essence, as the next farmer unmutes themselves to start talking, whoever you are, in essence, these farmers in this program are taking a representative sample of each activity like 2 or 3 times. So that's what's happening. You're rather than timing yourself every time you're involved with the crop, you're making sure to note and use the amount of space, the amount of bed space essentially that you're covering during a time, but you're saying it took me X amount of minutes to weed X amount of bed space, more or less, and taking an average of those few times. So when we say this is different from timing yourself every time you're doing an activity, that's one of the things we mean, in case that wasn't clear. But I'd love to hear from the next farmer.
I'll go. I don't want to cut anybody off or anything, but I think some of my takeaways, I'm similar to Erin in that in some way, like I am an analytical person, but I really suck at keeping track of things sometimes. So one thing I definitely learned this year through this study is like, it's one thing to have the best of intentions that you are going to track something, but then as soon as the activity is passed and you won't do it again, it really feels like a huge loss. Like if you miss the opportunity to actually do the time study, then it's really frustrating, right? So it's like, it's not just like a good intention or like, you know, like think I'm gonna have a notebook. Like I had the notebook, but I didn't have it like pre-programmed like on different pages of like every time study that I needed. And so I would go in periodically to the program and kind of check in and kind of forget what I was missing. And so I know like for me, for this year, the way that I want to do it better is to really have it planned out ahead of time. Like someone's question in the chat was like, what's your best method? Like, you know, a handwritten note or a mobile app. And I did take a lot of notes in my phone this last year, like when something was happening, so I didn't lose the time, but like the time tracking. But for this year, I'm really gonna have like, what do I want to call it? Like a spread, you know, a spreadsheet or a document where it's super clear, like every activity that I need the time study for and multiple, like Lenny was saying, maybe like 3 times per activity. And then also to not be swayed by like trying to look better than we are, like trying to get the quickest of the times, because that is hard for me. Like I want to imagine that we are more efficient and profitable than we are, like to feel better, but that does absolutely no bearing on your end profitability. So really like focusing on realistic, you know, run of the mill, not like, oh, the you know, the timer's on, so everybody go fast. So that was key for me. And then also, so I did involve my crew in that, like I do very little like tractor work or field prep because we have sort of like one full-time person that's almost always doing tractor work. And I consider him to be like a real bright guy. And so I explained to him what we're doing, and I explained to a couple other people that were helping do the time studies. And I was surprised how sometimes I would get the information back wrong. So I was trying to do a, which we found a workaround for, but trying to get to like how much, how long you could run a tractor on a gallon of fuel, so to speak. And so I said, what I need is like, you know, what you're doing. And so you're going to run the tractor for so long. I need the amount of time you're going to run the tractor, and then you're going to fill it up again. Start with a full tank, do this thing, tell me how long you did it for, and then fill the tractor back up, and we'll know how many gallons it took. And what he came back to me with was like what he did and how much gas it took, but no time. And so it was like, surprisingly, I thought, you know, like, he's smart, I'm smart, I know what I need. I explained to him what I need, but then I didn't get the right information. So I think for me, what I've realized is it needs to be written down. Like, I'm going to hand you a piece of paper telling you like exactly what I want. So I don't need anything extraneous. I only need 1, 2, and 3. And same thing with like multiple people transplanting. Like I would get some information back, but it was like it wasn't as clear as I needed it to be. So I realized for me, it's like writing it down with ultimate clarity to get it back in the format that I need it. So that's what I learned.
I think Gina's going to chime in. Nope.
I'm trying. Yeah, I think, kind of echoing Shanti too. I mean, it's kind of surprising. I surprised myself how difficult it is to get the damn time studies or like, you know, to remember to do all the parts. Or like sometimes I would go out and I would be so proud that I remembered to start timing myself, and then, you know, we'd finish the task and wander off, and 3 hours later I would, you know, finally remember to stop the stopwatch. So yeah, it was tricky for me to get, it was trickier than I thought it would be to get the actual time studies. And I joined this study a bit late in the game, kind of like, I think it was kind of like high season, you know, when we already had stuff blooming, I believe. I can't remember what month it was, but anyway, so I would say one of my tips and one thing that I'm excited about for this coming season is just starting as early as possible in the season. So you know, these things that are inevitably going to happen, forgetting to take time studies or getting the wrong time study or whatnot. So you have multiple and, you know, hopefully many opportunities to get them. So yeah, and like Shanti said too, like getting set up and figuring out all of the time studies that you're going to need to get early in the season. So then you're not, because I was also kind of doing that process, you know, mid-season, kind of like trying to catch up and do it as I went. So getting, like a spreadsheet is a great idea. So you can see all your tasks and then just literally going down and plugging them in and filling it out. And you can see, like what your holes are and what other data you need to get. And so you're not so behind. Like, for instance, on a lot of mine, because again, I was kind of like, in the thick of it when I joined, you know, I didn't get all 3. I would love to have gotten 3 time studies for each task, but on some of them I only got 1 or 2, which I felt like were good, you know, like average harvests or whatever I was tracking. But would be obviously great to get more of an average of a few harvests. And then also, delegating, because it's so, even just tracking one crop, it's like, you know, you think you get it, or at least I got excited and ambitious and I want to track every crop on the farm. And it's like, with every crop, there's a million tasks. So just simplifying. And part of simplifying is delegating for me. So, you know, I would be in charge of tracking one thing, and then I would have some of the crew help me track other things. And I think that it was really great to have the crew involved too, because they felt ownership over those things, and they started to kind of, you know, connect the dots and realize why these things were important. And I really enjoyed looping some of our crew in on this, and I'm excited to do that even more. And yeah, we all kind of, old management here keeps little, like the little mini moleskin notebooks on us. So yeah, like I had a log going in my notebook, and then Phoebe, who works with us, she had a log of a different task in her notebook, and then we would get together and combine results. So yeah, delegating, starting early. Yeah, those are kind of my takeaways. And also one more thing, I would say doing it for a second season too is also going to be really helpful, because you realize in retrospect the things that you missed out on, and then come your next season, you're wiser, and you're more in tune, I think, to the data that you actually need once you've kind of seen the whole equation. So that's all.
Perfect. Thank you for that. And I see Tanya answering some questions in the chat too, and I think she'll speak to one of those in a minute. I also wanted to say that in terms of the activities, you hear us talk about the inputs for the farm and then the labor activities. And the way the program is set up is that really the farmers start by making a list of all the activities they do on their farm related to these crops. So often that starts with prepping the bed, whether that's with a tractor or by hand. And then they kind of think about the sequence of events that happens from start to finish of that crop. The definition of when that crop starts and when it finished is a little tricky in terms of, do we start with taking out the old crop or adding the new crop? And that can be decided per each farm, but that's, Tanya will talk to more of the nitty gritty in a second in terms of the units, I think, but that's where it starts, making a list of all the things that happen on your farm. And you can make that list in a spreadsheet, you can make it on a piece of paper, but that's what you're tracking, all the different steps in as small of a chunk as possible. So if you're asking, we do this thing, but it's really 3 different activities, then I think it's best to make it into 3 distinct activities. And that's what I've learned from the Know Your Cost to Go program. So Tanya, if you want to chime in.
Yeah, I'll try to, there are like a few questions that all kind of fell into this and like tying on what you've all each talked about. I think one question was around what the specific data points are that are getting tracked. And so I would say that there are 2 total minutes and total units for the activity. What the units are depends on the activity. The units for harvest are going to be the crop units, and you can name them whatever you want, but they'll probably either be bunches or stems. And that's really the place I would encourage folks to start for this season. If you're super excited about this and wanting to try it out for other things, you can go for it. The other units, there's a little more nuance to some of those, but the other units would be for activities in the field. Would either be measures of area, or so either bed feet, row feet, drip row feet, which is referring specifically to drip tape, and then the number of plants. And how you choose what unit to use is kind of part of that is something that would probably be better to say, like, let's talk about that as you get started for 2024. If you're wanting to do some time studies on greenhouse production, the unit there is always going to be the number of trays, with the assumption that you're in a consistent tray size, like a 10-20 cell tray. But we weren't really intending to get too into the weeds on all this, so that's probably all I'll say. But what I want to emphasize is you're really writing down 2 things: total minutes, total units, which means template wise, there is not a set template because it's really that simple. And I think it really comes down to like, what will you use in the field? Every activity could have a different recording mechanism. What I would really think about, and I don't know for these growers how much this was useful, but I do think that like Gina said, it's like sometimes it's hard to remember to start the time study. Or someone else might have said that. Sometimes it's hard to remember to stop the clock, but thinking about how you can have the actual recording mechanism be a visual trigger or cue to help you remember can be useful, which I would say is probably the main argument against using your phone, because your phone isn't going to visually remind you unless you have a way to like set a notification. But I think thinking about that piece is almost more important than like the piece of paper where things are written on is very simple, but yes, you do need to make that. And Shanti, I think you talked about it. The thing there I'd add is like really investing the time before the season starts on figuring out your system, as if you're going to go on vacation the whole season and someone else is going to do it and you're handing it off to them. Because I don't think the time studies, and you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think doing the time study takes that much extra time, but what it takes is brain space, and that is in short supply. And so you want to try to take all the possible thinking out, even though maybe you don't really have more space to think in the winter, but theoretically you do now. So take all the thinking out of the process by thinking through exactly how it's going to work during the season, so that when you get out there and you're harvesting, you're just like, yep, total minutes, total stems, done. And then I guess the last thing I'll say here is just that the point around like doing more time studies this season. I think one of the things about time studies that I think is useful, having tried to do a version of this on a vegetable farm that wasn't using time studies, where we were collecting all the time, the time studies don't really expire. And so if you have some of those rates from this season, unless you really change the way that you're planting, for example, if you have a rate for planting, then next year, if you add on 10 more rates, you can just build on that. And so I think it's just nice because it's not tied to like a particular, bed or planting or whatnot. It's really flexible in terms of how you use the information. And it does take more than one season to dial in the systems, but I have seen folks really, take off more exponentially once they get that going. So I'll stop talking, but just wanted to, I think I addressed all the questions in the chat. If there's something still out there, please feel free to chat more or unmute and ask us.
Yeah, and I think that's it for the chat. And I think in a minute we'll wrap up, but I believe Tanya and I will stay after a little bit if there are a few more specific questions, right? Okay, let's just go ahead and wrap up unless Tanya had anything else to add. I don't think so. I'll let her add in a second, but I want to say thank you all so much for coming. This has been wonderful, and we really have loved sharing this with you. And we hope that you take some of the approaches from today and apply that to your farm. I know it can be a little tricky to then like want to get started, but to not have the tools. And I think creating a system on your own is a great start. I want to thank the farmers for participating and for being here today. A huge thank you to Tanya and a huge thank you to WSARE as well. So I'll let Tanya say goodbye and then we will wrap up and everyone can leave except if you want to stick around and ask us specific questions. So thank you.
Yeah, I'll just say, Lenny, that if there's interest in 2024 Know Your Cost to Grow, that we will send something out to everyone that attended just to let you, say, yes, I want to stay informed on that. That doesn't usually start till we'll say January of 2024. I know if you're in a totally different part of the country, that might not be the right time for you. Feel free to reach out to me directly. Also, I'm at tanya@tilth.org. Thanks, Lenny. And yeah, thanks for the work you're all doing farming, and thanks for being here today.
Perfect. Thank you. All right. Goodbye, everyone. Unless you're sticking around. Thanks for coming. Someone said so cool to see all these powerful women farmers. That's awesome. All right, if you're still here and you want to ask a question, go ahead and unmute yourself.
All right. Hi, Lainey. Thanks so much for this webinar. I really appreciate it.
Oh, hey, Jen. Hi.
Hi. My specific question I just wrote in the chat box, but is around perennials. In terms of that initial input is really high, and that could be true for peonies or anything that's multi-year. How do you go about calculating that initial input? Do you then divide by the number of life years of the plant and add that per year, similar to the dahlia example? Does that make sense?
It does make sense. I'm doing the thing right now where I wonder if I just jump to letting Tanya answer because she'll do a better job, or I give it a try. I'll give it a try. this program in particular was initially set up for annual vegetables, I believe. But I guess perennials as well. But yeah, basically you are thinking about spreading the cost of that initial input of the crop, I believe, over the years in production. I'm actually going to let Tanya go ahead and jump in.
Yeah, I mean, so Know Your Cost to Grow isn't set up for that. I've like thought about this with some other projects. I think part of it is asking what is the question you're trying to answer, and where are you at in like your decision process. So if you haven't put a peony into the ground, I'm just randomly using that as an example, then you might ask like what the costs are going to be over the life of the planting. And so that might tell you like, is it going to be worth it to plant these, because I'm going to have to cover that whole cost distributed over that time. The other way of looking at it would be like, if those were already planted, then from a decision-making standpoint, if your question is, should I keep producing these? The cost of what you already put in the ground is a sunk cost. And so it may make sense to keep doing that until that planting needs to be replaced. So again, you have to just kind of think about it in terms of like, what is your question that you're trying to answer? And if it's like, will I recoup the costs that I put in, then sure, you could look at them over the life of the planting, just like you would look at any other investment. That's my answer. I think that that would be my answer, at least for today, in terms of where I'm at in my thinking about that.
There was a good example from a few years ago at an ASCFG conference from Jello Mold Farm comparing raspberries versus dahlias. And she was using her own system based on Richard Wiswall. And but she, eventually did find that her perennial woody crops were way more, she used the word profitable, way more profitable for her in the long run. And what she did was she did divide that initial raspberry plant over its lifespan. So yeah, Jen Jen, who asked the question, is a rose farmer.
Yeah, thank you. That helps. I'm just thinking this through, and it is a sunk cost, as you said. So just thinking about, and it helps as well for expansion. Is it good to then add another half acre versus just, I feel it in my gut that it'd be a good idea to actually have the numbers there.
Right. And that's where it would shift in terms of, it's a sunk cost if it happened in the past, but if you're thinking about that expansion, then you would want to take that into account.
Great. And also, by the way, the farmers in the study who you're sticking around because you're trying to be good, if you want to leave, feel free to leave. Thank you but I love having you here. Yeah, let's open it up to other questions from people. I see there's a number of farmers still here, including Sel from England, which I didn't see you were here. I'm glad you are. I mentioned Sel to Tanya because Sel is in England and does tons of crop costing with like every crop on her farm and has figured it out to a T, and also teaches other farmers in England and beyond how to do this kind of work. And she's just wonderful. But let's open it up to any other questions.
I was just going to add something that I wanted to say earlier. This is Shanti. Because Tanya mentioned it, like how to keep the records, and if you have like a trigger, so your phone's not really a trigger. But I remember one of the, kind of in the tool, the Know Your Cost to Grow tool, there was maybe like a photo, and it was like maybe like a laminated sign on the tractor that was like time study ? Like a thing that you're going to walk up to do the thing that you're supposed to track, like visually in your face, telling you, to reminding you to do the time study. So like for me, it might be like, if I'm only going to track, the dahlias that I cut from one row, I want to like put in a T-post and like put up 8.5 by 11 piece of paper that won't get wet, like reminding me, or not me, but my crew or whoever's going to do it, to do that time study every time they're in that exact right spot. Because I don't want to track every dahlia I cut. I want to track like a snapshot of them to extrapolate from. So I don't know if that's helpful, but that's what I'm going to do more of this year.
Yeah, that's great. And someone actually made a suggestion at some point that, kind of going back to Gina's point around, like similar, Shanti, but to Gina's point about forgetting to like stop timing, which is a little bit goofy, but there's two ways you could do it. One is I've gotten some folks stopwatches that they wear because it's like a better way to be like, oh, right, I'm timing this thing. And so then you have something that's you're more conscious of. The other thing would be that you don't have to time yourself to like completion. You could just set your timer, right? So like, let's say you were like, I'm going to time myself harvesting dahlias for an hour. So you set your timer and count, and when the timer goes off, so then you're not having to forget. So it's a little harder maybe if you're doing something where you won't know, like it's easier to be like, oh, I don't know, I hoed 100 bed feet versus like, wait, how many bed feet was that if I'm just going off the timer? But I think that is definitely worth playing with, because I do think that like remembering to start is one thing, and then remembering to stop the time is another thing.
Yeah, for sure. Like even if you put a 30-minute timer, you're harvesting and you're halfway down the row, that gets you closer than just guessing completely.
Sure.
Any other questions from anyone are welcome. All right, you know, it's kind of cool that means a bunch of people are just sticking around wanting to listen to more conversation. So, you know, I'll give it one last chance in a second to see if anyone wants to ask anything, and otherwise I think we'll wrap up. But this has been wonderful, and thank you all for tuning in. So one more last chance to ask a question. Speak now.
I feel like if Michelle has any tips on time tracking, she should give them, because she's like the queen of like, oh, I didn't even have to try because I already do that.
Thanks, Shanti. Yeah. I feel like you guys actually covered it all. Assigning it to a person is the best thing, and I guess the only thing I would just sort of echo, but like my crew was so into this, like they loved it, and you know, so I didn't really have to do a lot. I made a list of each really specific task and how many times it needed to be tracked, and like I actually like put blanks on this piece of paper so they had to fill it in. And like our culture is like either crossing things off a list or erasing them from the dry erase or whatever is like the reward at the end. And so like they just owned it after that. And so I made different colored spreadsheets for each crop that we were tracking, and then the front page of the clipboard just had like this like list of tasks and blanks. And I assigned a couple of people to like really own the oversight of that. But the best part was then they were saying to like whoever was in that crop at that moment, hey, can you time this? And it sort of got the whole team involved, and that was really fun. They're asking to go over the results now as a crew, and we were really inspired. This year, we're actually going to go a little rogue and do only harvest time studies, because I was really impacted by how much of the time of a crop is spent on harvest and post-harvest. So we're going to focus on tracking more crops, but just harvest and post-harvest, so that we can really drill down those times. And then I can know, like the worst is when like, I'm like, I need 10 buckets of marigolds, and I'm like, where are you guys? Like it has been so long. And so I want to know what the average time is. And then, you know, 20 minutes in, I should know if it's a hard harvest day or not a hard harvest day. And that can be communicated back really fast to me or my crew leader. And then we can like move people onto that crop or make adjustments to harvest something different for our bouquets or whatever because of that. So I don't know if that's really a tip, but like the more people you can involve, the more excited they all are about it. And the way we work is like, if our orders aren't filled, we can't go home, and everybody wants to be done on time. And so it's like never about like, this is like our culture that we talk about all the time. So it wasn't particular to this study, but like, I always tell them I need accurate information, because I'm doing all this math on like how long something's going to take based on the rates you guys have given me. And if you're underestimating your time, you're like screwing over all your coworkers, because we're all going to be here doing this work till the end of the day. So they just got really into it. So that would be my biggest thing, is just really involve your crew.
I love that. And the farmer Leah Rogers, who is in our study for this upcoming year, she spoke at the Pacific Northwest Flower Meetup recently. She said something that really stuck with me, which was that I think it was her, our job as a manager is to help our crew get better, help our crew perform and help them complete the tasks in the easiest, most efficient way possible. And people like that. So, it's not about telling your crew to go faster. It's about breaking down the process into the most bite-sized chunks you can. And then as the manager, helping to identify and then give them the tools they need in order to best complete that task. So that kind of, I brought that piece back to the Know Your Crops to Grow program mindset with me, and thinking of this is what we're trying to do on our farms. We're trying as managers to improve our farms, but to ultimately empower our employees as well, which is, a great feeling. I think as having been an employee, it feels great to know that you are working towards the success of the farm and that you're also being supported from the top. So weird note to end on, but I thank you all. In a second, I'm going to click the big red end button here. Tanya, I think you've said your final words, unless you have anything else. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you all. This has been great. I appreciate you all being here. All right. Bye.